So Susan is Chair of Quantitative Criminology at the University of Edinburgh School of Law, and she has been directing the Understanding Inequalities project for a couple of years now, and leads the strand of work on research, crime and justice and inequalities over the life course. She's of course well known for her work on the Edinburgh Youth Transitions project. So this afternoon, Susan is going to be talking about how people how police officers in Scotland can use stop and search less to lead to more inequality without more crime. Thank you very much. Susan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. This second part of the presentation aims to build on the themes raised by John, especially around issues around cultures of policing practice, issues of proportionality, and the role of policing fairness and effectiveness in driving police legitimacy and public confidence. Drawing on research from members of the Understanding Inequalities team who are listed here, it aims to explore another aspect of policing response to crime that's experienced quite significant scrutiny and critique in recent years, namely that of stop and search. So drawing together various pieces of work, I aim to show that strongly held beliefs about police use of stop and search as a means of driving down crime don't necessarily mirror reality. However, better public messaging around recent changes in the use of stop and search in Scotland, which have increased fairness and effectiveness, could help to improve public confidence in policing. So let's start by considering what the purpose of stop and search is. It's widely agreed that the primary purpose is to tackle crime, and in doing so to protect the public. And that's relatively uncontroversial. But the mechanisms by which these aims are achieved are a bit less clearly defined. Here are two examples. According to the Metropolitan Police website, stop and search protects the public by preventing crime, catching criminals and building public confidence, while the Police Scotland website notes that stop and search is used to prevent, investigate and detect crime. Other policing websites show a similar pattern, and the combination of both deterrence through prevention and detection through finding things that people shouldn't have is fairly universal. But what's the evidence that stop and search actually reduces crime? Most of the research in this area of policing has been done in the US or the UK. Some of the earliest research was done in the US over 40 years ago now, and these early studies found that more stop and search did appear to result in large reductions in crime. However, more recent research carried out within the last decade or so have been much less optimistic and suggested that there's either a weak or a non-existent relationship between searching and crime. Most of the research carried out in the UK has largely concurred with these latter US studies, finding little or no relationship between search and crime rates. Indeed, the most recent studies, which are far more methodologically sophisticated, are the least likely to show any significant effects. But having said all that, there are some limitations to the type of research that's been carried out to date. Firstly, none of these early studies have attempted to understand the impact of search on crime in the context of major legislative change in the use of stop and search. Few studies have attempted to examine the effect of search on crime across different spatial units, and few of these studies have considered whether wider issues of effectiveness, fairness or proportionality are important in terms of the use of stop and search across local communities. So this paper is going to try and address all of these issues using Scotland as a case study. Now, until very recently, stop and search was a subject of little discussion or debate in Scotland, and that contrasts really sharply with the situation in England and Wales, where there's been a long history of controversy over the use of stop and search, resulting in significant oversight, scrutiny and regulatory reform. In comparison, police use of this tactic in Scotland flew very much below the radar until about 2014, when Kath Murray published findings from her PhD thesis, which highlighted a large growth in numbers, extensive use of consensual searches, but little or no scrutiny or safeguards, all of which sparked significant level of both press and political attention. Police in certain parts of Scotland had relied very heavily on stop and search to tackle violence and knife crime, which was a significant problem at that time in some parts of Scotland. However, this led to an unrestricted use of consensual or non-statutory searches, which became emblematic of a performance culture whereby targets, including the number of stop and searches carried out, became a key driver of police activity. Widespread review of stop and search by a number of official bodies recommended sweeping reforms, and as a result, the 2016 Criminal Justice Scotland Act It brought in tighter regulations on the use of the tactic and introduced a new code of practice for stop and search in Scotland. An independent advisory group appointed to oversee changes in stop and search published a review of the use of the code of practice 12 months after its implementation and found there'd been a significant reduction in the use of stop and search and a resultant increase in the positive search rate. However, there was still evidence of differential use of stop and search across different localities in Scotland. Moreover, the changes weren't welcomed by everyone, and particular concern was expressed within some circles that falling search rates were likely to reduce Police Scotland's capacity to tackle crime and may even result in a rise in crime, especially violence. So 3 years on from the implementation of the Code of Practice, what has been the impact of these changes in stop and search? And what we aim to do is answer these 4 specific questions. Firstly, how do search rates and crime rates compare before and after the introduction of the Code of Practice in Scotland? Secondly, what is the impact of search rates on crime rates? Thirdly, how do relationships vary across different police divisions? And finally, has legislative change impacted on equality, proportionality and effectiveness of policing practice at a local level? To answer these questions, we draw on data from Police Scotland, which includes management information on the daily stop and search numbers across Scotland and daily information on recorded crime. For recorded crime, we're focusing on susceptible crimes, so that's those that are likely to be affected by stop and search, so it excludes things like domestic forms of crime, shoplifting and other incidents unlikely to be affected by street-based policing. To examine spatial variation in policing, we use data aggregated to the level of Scottish multi-member wards or electoral zones, and we also aggregate the daily figures so that we're looking at change by weeks and months in line with prior research. So let's start by examining how the search rates changed over time. And this figure here shows the average number of searches across wards for each month from June 2015 to December 2018. We can see that there was a very sharp decline in the rate of stop and search over the first 6 months, which occurred well before the introduction of the Code of Practice in May 2017. This illustrates the change in police practice following publication of the official reviews recommending tighter restrictions on the use of stop and search. Over the next 2 years, that's 2016 and 17, there's an ongoing decline before the numbers start to pick up again in 2018. However, they don't return to anything like their previous levels. This graph indicates that the introduction of the new legislation and the Code of Practice did have a profound effect on levels of stop and search in Scotland. As you can see, the majority of all searches are drug-related, which does show the greatest decline, but there were also declines in weapon and property searches, especially at the start of the period. So what happened to crime rates over this period? Did they soar? Well, as you can see, not very much happened. There were some fluctuations, often reflecting seasonal trends, and although it's hard to detect, there was actually an overall reduction in recorded crime over the whole period. However, it's clear that large reduction in searches didn't have any major impact on crime at an aggregate level, which contradicts any suggestions that falling search rates were going to result in a big rise in crime. Now, measuring the impact of search rates on crime rates is quite complex analytically and required us to use what's known as a cross-lagged fixed effects model. This allowed us to examine the lagged effect of search rates in one particular time period, so by month or by week, on the crime rates at the next time period. In doing so, we took account of the lagged effect of crime rates, the contemporaneous effect of stop and search, and the introduction of the Code of Practice. But for reasons of time, I'm not going to discuss this here, but I'm happy to answer any questions on that. The table shows the results of our analysis looking at the relationship between the total rate of search, regardless of search type, and the total crime rate, regardless of crime type. We're primarily interested here in the lag of total search rate, which tells us whether there was a significant impact of the rate of stop searches in 1 week or month with the rate of crimes recorded in the next week or month. We can see here that there was a significant weekly effect, but not a significant overall monthly effect. In other words, there does appear to be a short-term effect, but no longer-term effect. However, the coefficient sizes, as you can see, are positive and they're also very small. This suggests that a 1% increase in the rate of stop and search in 1 week could be expected on average to be associated with a 0.008% increase in the crime rate in the following week. This is a very small change and unlikely to have much, if any, noticeable effect. So what does this tell us? Essentially, like the majority of other studies into the effect of stop and search on crime rates, there's evidence of a very, very weak effect. It doesn't suggest that more stop and search reduces crime. Indeed, in this case, it suggests that it may play a very small part and a short-term role in driving crime rates up. But does it make a difference when you consider the type of search and the type of crime? The answer is yes. Here we've summarised the results of the same analysis, but this time looking at different reasons for conducting the search and type of crime rates recorded. As you can see, the main effect appears to be in relation to drug crime, regardless of the type of search carried out. Therefore, there's an increase in any type of stop and search was associated with a slight increase in the rate of drug-related crime recorded in the following week or month. Again, the effect sizes here were very, very small, which suggests that the overall impact of stop and search is minimal. The reasons for these effects cannot be determined from this analysis, and I think further research would be really valuable in terms of establishing this. On the positive side, it could be that intelligence and information that's accrued as a result of stop and search may be used in the short term to drive evidence-led approaches to targeting drug-related crime. On the negative side, it could be that the removal of drugs from a suspect through stop and search could result in an increase in drug-related offending in an effort to replenish the supply. It's difficult to say from this work. There is some suggestion here that searches could also have a slight effect on crimes of dishonesty, although the effect is far less consistent. And there's only one result that's negative. Interestingly, that's the result in the relationship between weapons searches in 1 month and a reduction in crimes of violence in the next month. But it's hard to draw any conclusions from this one small and very weak result. But it could be indicative of intelligence-led policing or some very small-term deterrent effect. Now, we're interested particularly to develop this analysis to examine whether the effect of stop and search on crime rates varies across the country. So, looking again at the effect of the total search rate on the total crime rate across 12 of 13 Scottish police divisions, we can see no significant effects for the most part. Only 3 divisions show a result that passes the significance threshold, and as before, the actual effect sizes are positive and very, very weak. Ayrshire, Forth Valley and Tayside all show significant relationships between the rate of stop and search in 1 week and the crime rate in the next week, and Tayside also shows an even weaker monthly effect. Now, there's no immediately obvious rationale to this pattern. These divisions are all in different command areas. Ayrshire's in the west, Forth Valley's in the east, Tayside's in the north. They all show different patterns of stop and search before and after the introduction of the Code of Practice, and they were not particularly similar in terms of changes in detection rate. Again, further work is needed to understand if these patterns are related to differences in local policing. If we look in a little bit more detail across the 12 divisions by search type and crime type, we find that it's quite a mixed picture across the national police divisions. We do find some evidence of significant relationships, especially for Tayside, Forth Valley and Ayrshire, but also for other police divisions. On the whole, these effects are still very small in absolute terms and largely positive. However, there were a few negative results here and there, and those are marked with a little negative sign. Again, no clear picture other than to say that the 2 northern divisions, Tayside and North East, appear to be overrepresented in this table compared to divisions in the east and the west. So there may be a spatial dimension to these results, but again, further work would be needed to establish the reasons behind this. Now, looking at the level of police divisions doesn't exactly equate to localism. If we want to really consider issues of equality and proportionality in policing practice, it's necessary to examine the extent to which changes in search rates impact across different communities of Scotland. It's well known from the literature that both recorded crime rates and search rates tend to be higher in more deprived communities, and Scotland is actually no different. The figure on the left here shows the average crime rates in Scotland between the 20% most deprived and 20% least deprived electoral wards. These are presented across 3 different time periods according to the distinctive trends in stop and search. So the light blue is the period of very sharp decline at the beginning of the stop and search from June 2015. The middle blue is the period of very low, kind of gradually declining searches, and then the dark blue is the period of increasing searches towards the end. As we can see, there's more than double the amount of crime recorded in the most deprived Scottish wards on average compared to the least deprived. The letter R here represents the ratio of the crime rate in the most deprived areas to that in the least deprived at each of the 3 time points, and shows that it increases slightly from 2.4 to 2.6 over the 3 time periods, but not really very much change. The figure on the right shows the change in the average search rates for the 20% most and least deprived wards over the same 3 periods. And what we can see is that in period 1, when search rates were very, very high, the ratio of searches between the most and least affluent communities was 3.5. However, during the period of very low searches and then the period immediately after that, when searches start to increase again, the ratio is reduced to a level that's actually much more in line with the ratio of crimes across these areas. These changes indicate that the major reduction in searches in Scotland has resulted in a reduction in inequality in the use of searches between rich and poor neighbourhoods. While there's still a higher use of search in deprived communities, it's far more in line with the level of crime that's recorded there, which provides a strong indicator of more fairness and proportionality in policing practice. Of course, fairness and proportionality supposes that the policing response to demand for service should be driven by the crime problem rather than the characteristics of the community. So do we find that changes to stop and search in Scotland have resulted in greater equality in the use of searching across deprived and non-deprived areas according to the amount of crime that's found there? The answer to that is yes. The figure on the left here shows the rate of search per crime in each of the 3 periods. We can see that in period 1, when search rates were very high, there were 1.4 times more searches for every crime in the 20% most deprived areas than the 20% least deprived areas. However, when the search rate fell, the level of crime-related searches became much more equivalent. Indeed, it swung slightly in the opposite direction. A truly equitable policing response should have a ratio of 1, assuming that all other factors are equal. So we can see this has been largely achieved over these 2 latter time periods. But what about the effectiveness of stop and search? The figure on the right compares the positive search rate within the most and least deprived wards of Scotland. You can see that as search rates declined, there was a gradual increase in the percentage of positive search rates in the 20% least deprived wards. In the most deprived, there was that substantial increase in the search rate during period 2, when search rates were at their lowest, and then a slight reduction again in period 3, when search rates started to increase again. The ratio between the most and least deprived wards shows that there tends to be a higher success rate in detecting items for searches conducted in the most deprived areas. However, this was highest when the actual level of search was very low. In other words, more searches in deprived areas are likely to reduce the overall effectiveness. Finally, these figures confirm that there's been an increase in inequality between communities in Scotland in terms of the distribution of stop and search. These are what are known as Lorenz curves, which are based on a Gini coefficient, which is more commonly used to measure economic inequality between countries. On the left, the curve shows that there's inequality in the rate of crime across different Scottish wards, although this remains stable over the 3 periods at a value of around 0.45. On the right, the same curve shows that there's also inequality in the rate of stop and search across Scottish wards, although this declined with the general reduction in the use of stop and search, and by period 3 was actually starting to approach the same level as that of the crime rate at 0.5, another indicator of growing relative equality. So, what does this all mean? Well, firstly, it's difficult to overstate the degree of controversy and unease that the proposed changes to stop and search in Scotland caused within policing circles, which was to a very large extent underpinned by a general belief that more stop and search must reduce crime. Nevertheless, like most other studies of this type, we found no material impact of the very large reduction in stop and search on overall crime rates. When examining the lagged effect of stop and search in one period on crime rates in the next, we did find some very weak short-term and mostly positive effects, especially for drug-related crime. However, it was hard to detect any consistent or clear pattern of findings at the level of individual police divisions. Indeed, the level of variation is largely indicative of there being a high degree of localism in police practice, which probably extends to the way that stop and search is used to deal with particular demand-related issues. It's interesting that the largest effect, albeit a small one, of stop and search on crime rates was found in Tayside. This could be indicative that Stop and Search in the Tayside Division plays a particular role in the detection and gathering of further evidence in relation to drug-related crime, which could be a very positive outcome. Or it could be that removal of drugs from suspects results in some degree of drug-related offending to replace what's been taken from them, which could be a negative outcome. Either way, our findings suggest these relationships are worthy of further investigation. Regardless of the degree of localism in policing, we found that less stop and search resulted in greater equality, proportionality and fairness between the most and least deprived communities when the rate of search was anchored against the crime rate. And we found greater effectiveness in terms of positive outcomes, especially when the rates of stop and search were at their lowest. So, what are the implications? Well, firstly, it's important to challenge cultures of practice within policing. It's easy to become seduced into a pattern of behaviour that feels right at an intuitive level, but may not have the desired outcome. Police data are an absolutely invaluable resource to determine whether belief mirrors reality and could be used to far greater extent in the drive to improve oversight of policing, improve accountability of service, and demonstrate to the public that it's working to the best effect. Moreover, it's imperative to consider the impact of policing at the level of smaller localities, such as wards, but actually even ideally smaller, rather than divisions, which inevitably show large variation of practice. Secondly, Police Scotland's values of integrity, fairness and respect are based on a human rights framework that is in line with principles of equality, effectiveness and proportionality. This analysis has demonstrated that doing less can mean doing more in terms of these key principles, and that shaping best practice in policing response can have a profound effect on reducing inequality without reducing overall effectiveness and proportionality. Finally, these findings could be of significant importance in highlighting the legitimacy of policing approaches and improving public confidence. We didn't find that less stop and search meant an increase in crime. However, we did find that stop and search became more aligned to levels of crime across Scotland's communities, which should give public more reassurance that policing strategies are proportionate to need. Greater use of public messaging to demonstrate the positive changes in the use of this important policing tactic around the twin tracks of detection and prevention could help to boost confidence in policing. Thank you.